Welcome to the MTA Podcast Series, a weekly audio cast featuring interviews with recognized industry professionals. And your host, Ed Carlson.
We mean, of course, the planetary pictures in the sky which are developing towards the tightest harmonic alignments in the most potent areas of the zodiacal circle ever recorded in Earth's written history. These portend increasing and maximizing intensity and rapidity of change on every level of existence: mineral, vegetable, animal, human, and spirit. Will capitalism survive? Will democracy survive? Will our markets survive? Will government survive? Will humanity survive? Will Earth survive? We don't know, but we'll be short for it. It's Tuesday, July 27th, 2010, and this is the MTA Podcast Series. And today's guest is Arch Crawford. Arch Crawford studied physics and math at the University of North Carolina, and from there went to work as a research assistant to Bob Farrell at Merrill Lynch in the early 1960s. Arch called the 1987 crash and the bull market in gold in April of 2001. On September 4th, 2001, Crawford specifically identified two separate Mars aspects that could lead to war and a steep drop in stock prices in the days ahead. Timers Digest ranked Arch Crawford as the number 2 market timer for the year ended October 24th, 2008, and he's been referred to by Barron's as Wall Street's best-known astrologer. Arch Crawford, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be here.
Well, we're delighted, and I believe as market timers, our timing couldn't have been any better. We couldn't have timed your interview at any better time than at any time in the last 1,000 years, and we'll explain that more in a moment. But Arch, if I had to summarize for Mom, let's say, what it is you do, I guess I would say that for 47 years, you have attempted to determine the direction of the markets through conventional astrological analysis and your use of technical analysis. Arch Crawford, my first question for our podcast today is this. So, how's that working for you?
It's working pretty good. While I was at Merrill Lynch, I predicted the crash in 1962 in November of 61. But that was not before I got into the planetary work at all. It was purely by technical analysis. But come April of 63, an article appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about people using astrology in the markets. And that's where I got the idea from. I was young, I was impressionable, and I decided to look into it. And what I found was quite amazing. So I have followed up on it. There's a negative impression about astrology among the general public as far as scientific orientation. What I did is purely run statistical studies against the planetary, the Dow Jones going all the way back for every astronomic sort of event. Mm-hmm. And there's a great deal of reverse superstition. I take this information to the scientific community, and they will not touch it with a 10-foot pole because of their reverse superstition. But
you know what? I'm going to
jump to Wall Street. Just let me finish this one sentence.
Yeah, okay.
I take it to Wall Street, and they say, "What's your record?" And I show them my record, and they buy it.
Let's talk about that reverse superstition. Let's address that right off the bat here before we get into performance numbers. There's a whole new age movement out there with all manner of seers, sunspot trackers, astrologers who work up natal horoscopes for companies based on their hour of incorporation, feng shui consultants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The joke is that you consult to some big names on Wall Street and in Europe, but when they call you, they make sure it's from a payphone. How do you differentiate yourself from the politically correct kumbaya crowd? That is, I know performance is number one, but, before people will even look at your performance, let's talk a little marketing here, perhaps.
Well, as I say, I just ran statistics, and that's the way I talk about it. I will say sometimes that astrologers say this and use traditional interpretations, and sometimes I don't. But usually, if I can do so, I stay with the statistical series. But when I can't figure out what an alignment will do to the stock market, I go to a book called Combination of Stellar Influences by Ebertin. I think it was written about 1912. And he analyzes 3-planet transactions and has very specific meanings. And there was one occasion when there was a solar eclipse, and it was involving Venus, Saturn, and Pluto. And I looked up, since that's 5 bodies, there's 3 on the left, 3 in the middle, 3 on the right. So I looked up the meanings in Ebertin, and it said, tragic love, socially awkward. And that's what I put in my newsletter for that day, and it was the day Princess Diana died.
Oh, wow.
Why should that work? You've got me there.
Yeah. Let's get right into the heart of our interview topic today, which derives from that opening quote, and I won't reread the whole thing, but you talk about the planetary pictures in the sky, which are developing towards the tightest harmonic alignments in the most potent areas of the zodiacal circle ever recorded in Earth's written history. You're referring to the Cardinal Climax, I assume. Can you tell us about the Cardinal Climax?
Yes. Well, I was with a friend who's an astrologer, and we went to a coffee shop, and he had brought his laptop, and we were just looking ahead maybe a few days at a time into the next year. And this was about a year ago. And he was flipping by, and I said, wait a minute, go back to that one. And we went back to it and checked out the tightest alignments that were happening during that time frame, and we both said, oh, expletive, deleted.
Uh-huh.
And it has 5 major planets aligned in the worst possible angles, squares and oppositions, and they were all at 0 degrees of cardinal signs. That's why the astrologers call it the Cardinal Climax. It's at 0 degrees of the cardinal signs, and the things that happen there are supposed by them to affect the whole world. So
now, supposed by who?
The astrologers say that.
And why do they think that? If it's never happened before, or hasn't happened in 1,000 years,
no,
why do
they're
they
just
think
that those points in the sky, things that happen at those points in the sky, tend to affect the whole world. Not this alignment, not this particular alignment,
got it.
but this particular alignment has 5 planets at 0 degrees of the cardinal signs. That's never happened before.
Well, actually, hasn't it happened at least once before, 1,000 years ago?
No. What happened is I've looked back to the beginning of the Dow Jones for all of these events. I've seen nothing close to this. Now, a colleague in Vienna, Austria, calculated the Bradley model, which is entirely astronomic related, the positive aspects minus the negative aspects. And he calculated it back 200 years and said we have a new low in it this summer of the 200-year period. Now, I mentioned this at an astrology conference at Cambridge, Mass. In February, and one guy gets up in the back of the room and he says, well, I checked back 1,000 years and there is nothing like this. And a guy across the room says, well, I checked back 10,000 years and there is nothing like this.
Is that possible?
Sure.
I mean, this is just... Determining these alignments that's simple. Not simple, but it's math, right? I mean, you can do it. You don't have to have been there.
Well, you can buy a cheap astrology program, and it's using NASA coordinate system.
Right. Okay.
You can carry it as far back as you want and forward as you want. Now, Pluto is the least stable orbit, and you might be 1.5 degrees off of Pluto in 1,000 years or so.
Now tell us when we should expect this.
Tell us what?
Tell us when we should expect the Cardinal Climax.
Well, the tightest part of the alignment is July the 30th to August the 1st. And we've had the beginning of it with the Saturn opposition to Uranus yesterday on the 26th. And the last time we had that, we had a Saturn opposition to Uranus in April the 26th, which happened to be the market top of the year so far. So that's the beginning of it, sort of. But the real tight alignments where Mars comes up and activates the whole thing is July 30th to August 1st, and another hit August 3rd, and some more echoes on the 8th, the 9th, 10th of August. Then we have the fall equinox will be a full moon across these same alignments, and the solstice in the winter on December 21st will have an eclipse of the moon across these same alignments at very low degrees of the cardinal signs, 0, 1, 2, somewhere along in there.
Yeah.
So there will be echoes afterwards, but the greatest power will be July 30th to August 1st, and I suspect that there will be reverberations in every kind of thing that happens.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move ahead. That's interesting. I'm sure a person can find out more about that at your website. You talked about Saturn in opposition to Uranus. I read terms like half aspect, the cardinal axes, 0 Aries, lunar eclipse forming with the angle of a T with a conjunction of Mars and Saturn. It's giving me a headache. How can a person come to an understanding of these terms, and how would you suggest that someone learn what it is you do?
Well,
how can you get educated in this art form?
Well, what I did is I just ran the statistics on what I was interested in, which was everything, just about. Then watching it reporting on it in the newsletter for 33 years, I've run into a lot of situations, and every alignment that was unique and the most powerful alignments through all of those years, and looking back to earlier years, there were important news events in the world. Not all of them affected the stock market.
Well, when you get one of these alignments, does the world necessarily break up on that day, or is that just the beginning of a force of nature that might culminate a week or a month later?
Can you please call back in a half hour? Yes. I would say that every alignment that was unique and powerful, an event occurred on the Earth that was emotionally recognized by a great many people. There was a book written about the tightest batching of planets over in one corner of the sky, that called the Pluto effect, the Jupiter effect. That was in 1982 in the spring. I think it was March the 9th, and we had the market dropped 15% down into that day and rallied 15% afterwards. And that kind of thing has been typical. There was a lunar eclipse forming a grand cross with Mars opposing Pluto, both square to the sun and moon in the lunar eclipse. And I said, this will be one of the worst days of the century. There will be coercion, the use of force, a large explosion, and heartlessness or cruelty, August the 2nd to the 7th of 1990. And on August the 2nd, Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait. The market tanked. But that was, Barron's thought that was such a cute quote that they put it in their Market Watch section, and I think they did it as a joke. But they would not write me up again for 3 years.
Let's talk about some people, including yourself, but let's start with, just real quickly, because we're coming down to the end of our time here, W.D. Gann used astrology, didn't he?
Yes, certainly.
What was his connection with astrology? And just real quickly, 30 seconds.
Well, he swore to people around him to secrecy about use of astrology, and Lieutenant Commander David Williams, who wrote the book Financial Astrology, introduced me to one of the people who had worked for Gann, and he said, yes, he did swear us to secrecy, but we didn't know anything anyway. But the people who bought Gann's papers from Billy Jones say that they have or Billy Jones, before he died, said he had a whole garage full of boxes of W.D. Gann's charts, and there were astronomical notations all over them.
Oh.
Before, go ahead. Before,
John the clock is really going fast, and I got a lot of stuff here. John Nelson. John Nelson. Why should we know that name?
John Nelson was a radio propagation specialist at RCA Corporation, and they in the 50s, 40s.
Okay.
And RCA, of course, had to do with all the information flow across the North Atlantic, which in those days was by short wave. And every time we had major magnetic storms on the Earth that hit across the North Atlantic, it threw off the transmissions, and they had to swing down to South America, over to Africa, and back up to Europe. It was time-consuming and costly. They put him on a top of a building in Wall Street with a 6-inch telescope and said, tell us when these things are getting ready to happen.
Really?
So he tried all kinds of regular cyclical work and got up to 65% accuracy, which was not enough. And someone said, well, why don't you look at the planetary alignment around the sun if that's what you want to predict? So he had no interest in astrology. He's a hard-nosed New Englander. And but he said, what the heck? And he took the 13 worst magnetic storms on record at RCA and drew the horoscope, the heliocentric, sun-centered charts, and was amazed to find multiple harmonic contacts among the planets looking out from the sun at the onset of these magnetic storms. He wrote a book about it. You can learn how to do it. It's called Cosmic Patterns.
Cosmic Patterns. Okay. Let's take a look at your personal history. Now, my understanding is despite the fact you studied physics and math at the University of North Carolina, you actually didn't finish school, but you were hired by Bob Farrell at Merrill Lynch. You know, that sounds very similar to Bob Prechter's story of having played drums in a rock band for 4 years and then getting hired by Farrell. Exactly how did that meeting between you and Farrell go? How did you end up getting hired?
I was not hired by him. I was hired by, I quit and I went to work for Merrill Lynch marking a chalkboard in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay.
I said, this is great. This is what I want to do. Send me to New York. And they said, don't be ridiculous. Well, 6 months later, it was coming up to Labor Day weekend. I said, I quit. I'm going to New York and look for a job. And they said, don't do that. We'll transfer you. So Labor Day weekend, I got on a bus and went to New York City. They upped my salary from $55 to $70 a week.
Oh, boy.
And I was drawing the charts for the 45 industry specialists in the research department. And that's where I made the prediction that the market would top in December and crash in 62. I said, if this pattern remains symmetrical, the top will be the middle of December, and it'll crash in 62. The top was the 13th of December, and it did crash. It was making a multiple head and shoulders rolling top pattern, and it broke the neckline on the day that Kennedy made the steel companies pull back on the price increase.
Okay.
And that's why it was purely political. It was not an economic situation.
I see. Arch, you spent time in Vietnam during the war. Can you tell us what you did there, and did that have any effect on your later work in the markets?
I don't know that it had effect on my later work in the markets. My MOS was artillery lieutenant, and I was my entire OCS class, or most of us, were taken back to intelligence school they wouldn't tell us what we were going to be doing, but they were teaching us intelligence methods. Mm-hmm. And they said, we can't tell you, it's secret. And as we were finishing up the 8-week course there, the whole story came out on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about the Phoenix program run by the CIA of assassinations in Vietnam. And 3 of my best friends went conscientious objector the next day. I went. I was in the program. And when they got enough intelligence officers, I was replaced. And then I was on a mobile advisory team in the Delta.
Okay.
I just spent a lot of time being depressed.
Just we're in these podcasts, we're trying to get some personal history, that goes beyond the research headlines and the websites, that sort of thing. And this is all good stuff. Listen, before we go, would you have any names to share with us? Perhaps your greatest influences or favorite books you would recommend to others who are interested in pursuing a study in this area?
Well, the best basic book about it is by Lieutenant Commander David Williams, called Financial Astrology. He had written a pamphlet called Astroeconomics in the 50s, and that was mentioned in the front page article in the Wall Street Journal, and I went out and bought that, and I eventually met him, and he was sort of a mentor to me along that line of business, where Farrell was also a mentor to me in the technical analysis section.
Okay. All right.
So that's my favorite. Then there's the Bradley model book that was done in booklet. It's about 58 pages, a booklet about how to create the model using all the planetary aspects. It was written by Donald Bradley, and I used that. I kept that by hand for several years, which I don't recommend. Which you can push the button now and have the whole thing printed out if you have.
No, I see. Arch, it's been just great having you with us today. Is there anything else you'd like to mention before we conclude?
Well, I just said in the letter that, I don't think this is the end of the world, but that there will be news items that could be quite significant. Actually, I was sort of half joking, saying that if the poles flip during this, we'll all be dead. If it's just a nuclear war, maybe only half of us. But that's not as much of a joke as it might seem. But I think that the outworkings of this, by the time we get the secondary hit on the fall equinox and the tertiary hit on the winter solstice, that we'll be in the greatest depression the world has seen. And you should prepare yourself and do what you can.
Yeah. Well, if all this comes to pass, we will definitely have you back for a follow-up interview. Today's guest has been Arch Crawford, and that wraps up today's MTA podcast. From Seattle, TechnicalAdvisors.com, I'm Ed Carlson, together with our recording engineer, Shane Squark in New York City. Say goodbye, Shane.
So long, everybody.
Let's keep our stops tight. Good day.